What a piece. That Romeo excerpt is a beautiful case in point. A brilliant illustration of deliberately exploiting ambiguity for aesthetic reasons, for increased expressive power. But ambiguous and beautiful as it is, it's only a hint of what's to come 2 decades later. Take that lonely opening phrase we just heard at the beginning with its ascending fourth and its chromatic dying fall, and stretch that fourth to a minor sixth with the same chromatic dying fall. And what have you got? Tristan, of course. Now take Berlioz's second phrase, which does indeed begin with a rising sixth, and continues in a chromatic climb. And what have you got? Isolde. Now put them together. And what have you got? Tristan and Isolde. See, the derivation of the Wagner from the Berlioz seems all too clear. For that history-making opening phrase of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde is, in fact, the conjoining of two sub-phrases, one on top of the other. The question is, who's on top? It seems a clear case of Wagnerian robbery, or to put it more politely, borrowing. But it's subtler than that. It's rather a phenomenon of transformational grammar in the most Chomskyan sense, where one surface structure, namely Berlioz, has become the deep structure of another surface structure, namely Wagner's. The transformations are extremely clear. The extension of the opening interval by enlarging the fourth to the sixth, and then the conjoining of the two strings. Quite unconsciously borrowed, of course, although we know of Wagner's almost envious admiration for Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet. We might say, in the semantic terms of our last lecture, that Tristan and Isolde is a giant metaphor of Romeo and Juliet. It's a lot to say, but it's irresistible. There are just too many instances of this Romeo into Tristan metaphor throughout the opera. Only recall the dance music of the ball scene we just heard. And now hear Isolde's panting anticipation at the start of Act 2 of Tristan. Just another remarkable coincidence? Well, here's another, which we just heard, Romeo in Love. Now, by the simple extension of a third to a fourth, it's expanded into Tristan in Love. Wow. And these examples are only a few among very many. We haven't even touched Berlioz's great love scene, the balcony scene, with its throbbing passions. Which goes on to this famous climax. I don't even have to play you Wagner's metaphor for that one, but I want to anyway. My purpose in all this is not to expose Wagner as a plagiarist, but as a transformational magician. I want to show to what extent a tonal language can grow from artist to artist, growing in expressivity and in magnitude over a span of a mere 20 years, just as we can see it grow from Haydn to Beethoven, or from Scriabin to Stravinsky. The examples are all through history. This happens to be a particularly striking one. And with this growth, there always comes the inevitable increase in ambiguity. Tristan is the very peak of ambiguity, the turning point after which music could never be the same again, because it points musical history directly toward the upcoming crisis of the 20th century. And this is because Tristan exploits ambiguity fully in all three of the linguistic modes we've discussed. Phonologically, for example, the highly chromatic opening bars of the prelude have fascinated analytical minds for over a century. What key are we in? Maybe no key at all. Did that cadence on the dominant seventh indicate A minor? But the dominant never resolves to the A minor tonic. Instead, there's a long pause, and the phrase is repeated, higher, more intense, with the rising minor sixth now stretched, transformed to a major sixth. Again ending on a dominant, but in a whole different key. Again, pause. And then again, even higher, more stretched out. Ending on yet another dominant. Pause. And this cadence is now echoed an octave higher, as if to say, this could be the one. Is it? Says Wagner, reiterating the last two notes. But the harmony, you see, has been dropped out, intensifying the ambiguity of the question. And again comes that fragmentation, an octave higher. Is it the one? And then finally, this is it, the original dominant in A minor. But no, the resolution is a deceptive cadence, not A minor at all. In other words, the resolution of all this ambiguity is in itself ambiguous. Is this tonality, or toying with tonality, or simply non-tonality? Wagner keeps you guessing. It's almost as if the extreme chromaticism of this music, with its fiercely unappeased sensual desire, can no longer be contained in a tonal framework. And this is why Tristan is the crisis work of the 19th century. While thinking about all this the other night, I made myself a diagram, just out of curiosity, to determine exactly the comparative frequency of the 12 chromatic tones as they occur in the first two measures of this prelude. I've had it drawn up, and the results are curiously interesting. All 12 tones appear at least once, and this in itself is significant in the light of the 12-tone music to come a century later. It's as though he's exposed a tone row. But there are 4 tones that predominate in that they occur more than twice. And these 4 tones, G sharp, F, D, and B, happen to form a diminished 7th chord. Now don't fret, I'm not going to explain that. But it's worth your knowing that the diminished 7th chord is the most ambiguous of all tonal formations. And for that reason, it became the favorite, even basic, ambiguous chord of all the Romantic composers. Maybe I should explain it a bit, after all. Every diminished 7th chord is capable of at least 4 different resolutions, which gives any such chord a minimum 4-way ambiguity. Now take this one we were just looking at, for instance. It can resolve here. And it can resolve here. And it can resolve here. And it can resolve here. At least those 4. There are many more resolutions I won't go into. No wonder the Romantics seized on this chord. It's so wondrously useful for all ambiguous situations, such as moody meandering. Where would Tchaikovsky be without that? Or noisy confusion. Where would Liszt be without that? Or abrupt dramatic suspense, as in Carmen. Suspense, tension. What's going to happen? Ambiguity. Now, the remarkable thing is that no diminished 7th chord actually occurs in these first 2 bars of the Tristan prelude. In fact, none occurs at all in the whole prelude. There are some people who insist that it does occur, but I'm of the opinion that there isn't one. I'll argue about that with anybody who cares to take up the subject. The diminished 7th chord, as I see it, is only suggested by the prevalence of these four tones, casting their ambiguous shadow, and thus their presence is felt hovering over the music as a diminished seventh chord, even though it's not there at all. Now ask yourselves, is that prevalence the result of calculation on Wagner's part? Now, all my instincts tell me no. It must have been an unconscious action or a subconscious action. For me, this is a perfect model of linguistic transformation at work, converting this hidden deep structure into a metamorphosed surface structure in which it is no longer even perceptible. Now, of course, all this chromatic ambiguity is reinforced to a great degree by the syntactic vagueness of the structure. Actually, this prelude is anything but a vague structure. It's very tightly knit together, but Wagner deliberately imposes upon it syntactic ambiguities to make it seem languishing, mysterious, and timeless. Timeless, that's the clue. The utter slowness of it all. Langsam und schmachtend, he writes on it. And then the interminable written out silences between the phrases. 4, 5, 7. And then the question of whether that first note was an upbeat or a downbeat. How can we tell? There's no meter to give us a clue. And by the way, how did we know that the corresponding phrase in Romeo began on a downbeat? Which it did. They sound exactly alike. There's no way to tell. And all these ambiguities, and many more, conspire to plunge us into a new dimension of time, quite different from anything before in music. It's a time which no longer ticks by, or even dances or saunters by. It proceeds imperceptibly as the moon moves, or as leaves change their color. And this is what gives Tristan its true semantic quality, quite apart from the obvious semantic facts of the text of Wagner's own poetry, of characters and magic potions and betrayal, and quite apart from leitmotifs signifying desire or death or whatever. I'm speaking of musical semantics as we've come to know it, as the sum of phonological and syntactic transformations producing this highly poetic, metaphorical language. And in this sense, Tristan is supreme. It's one long series of infinitely slow transformations, metaphor upon metaphor, from that mysterious first phrase through to the climactic heights of passion or of transfiguration, right to the end. I could even devise a deep structure for that opening phrase that would show you the final Liebestod already present in nucleus form, embedded, so to speak, in that one phrase. Look, in that phrase there are two appoggiaturas. Remember those leaning tones we were talking about before? The first one occurs here and resolves, as it should, there. And the second one is here, resolving here. Now, by simply deleting those two dissonant tones, we get this. Now, that's one possible deep structure nucleus, arrived at by deleting two appoggiaturas. Now we subject that embryo to a series of transformations, including inversion and others I won't go into, and we arrive at this. And by further transformation and inversion, we get this. And once we support that line with pure diatonic triads, freed from all chromatic writhing and tortuous frustration, we reach the final transfiguration. In my end is my beginning, said T.S. Eliot. Let's hear them both now, the beginning and the end of Tristan and Isolde. That may be the slowest performance of Tristan on record, but it was deliberate, and it's the way I see Wagner's score, and not only the way I see it, but what Wagner writes in his score. And I think if I've succeeded at all, it's to convey that essence of timelessness that I was talking about earlier, where you stop all the clocks in the world and you operate only in terms of Wagner's clock, which is, of course, an extraterrestrial one. I don't know, I think after that music, I can do nothing but suggest a brief pause, and I'll see you in a moment. And so music can never be the same again. The gates of chromaticism have been flung open, those golden gates of the golden age, which were the outer limits of ambiguity, standing firm in diatonic majesty. But now that they're open, now that Berlioz and Chopin and Schumann and Wagner have pushed them open, we're in new tonal fields that are apparently limitless. We're bounding and leaping from one ambiguity to the other, from Berlioz to Wagner to Bruckner and Mahler to Debussy and Scriabin and Stravinsky. It's a dizzying adventure, this romantic romp, shedding one inhibition after another, indulging in newer and ever more illicit ambiguities, piling them on, stringing them out, daring them to take over for nearly a whole century. But how ambiguous can you get before the clarity of musical meaning is lost altogether? How far can music romp through these new chromatic fields without finding itself in uncharted terrain, in a wild forest of sharps and flats? Are there no further gates of containment? Perhaps not golden ones, perhaps only dry stone walls or rude fences. Well, of course there are, or rather were, until they began to crumble under the attack of the new century. These tonal fences, walls of formality, somehow still managed to contain the rampage of chromaticism, even through the crises of Tristan and Isolde, and of Péléas and Mélisande, and the Rite of Spring. But ultimately, a supreme crisis did arrive, a crisis that remains unresolved to this day, and it's over half a century old. And as I said way back in the first lecture, if we're ever to face up squarely to Ives' unanswered question, if we're ever to understand this crisis, we must first understand what brought it about, how we got into this pickle in the first place. So in the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to try to give you a sense of this critical turn by examining and then listening to one short piece plucked out of musical history at a moment of particular stress. Debussy's Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, the afternoon of a faun, one of the last-ditch stands of tonal and syntactic containment, exactly as was the Mallarmé poem on which it's based. This enchanted faun came into being just before the turn of the century, at a moment when all the arts were standing on the brink of radical change. Not just stylistic change, I mean radical change. The tugs and strains that were wrenching at figurative painting had already produced Impressionism. The representational object was fast disappearing into washes of color, suggestive formations, chromatic, pointillistic fantasies. Cubism is around the corner, abstractions in the wind. Poetry has begun to show a remarkable disintegration of syntax a diffusion of meaning or of logical continuity that intoxicates the mind. The heart aches a bit too readily. A drowsy numbness pains the sense. A decadent aestheticism turns the horizon mauve in that last mauve decade. Salome, Des Esseintes, Dorian Gray are all standing in the wings. And everywhere hovers a delicious vagueness, a highly charged ambiguousness of dreams, images, and symbols. Baudelaire drifting in volupté, Rimbaud drifting in his bateau ivre, and Mallarmé turning himself on with anti-semantic pills, turning himself into a sort of faun, sort of remembering, perhaps dreaming, perhaps dallying with sort of nymphs, perhaps a couple, or is he one of the couple? Or was it Sicily? Where, when, who, what? All are submerged into the how, the ever-present now. Good Lord, I'm doing it myself. Mallarmé and I are drunk on chromatics. Phonology is taking over, you see. Syntax is a vague memory of something once learned. If all the arts, as Walter Pater said, aspire to the condition of music, then Mallarmé's poem is sure getting close. And when Debussy turns the faun into music, it's Mallarmé's dream come true. A drowsy numbness does indeed invade this opening bar. Where are we? In what key are we hearing this flute of Pan? It's in no key at all. Well, maybe E major. Oh yes, definitely E major. But then, here's vagueness again. Resolving to the most unlikely chord possible, the dominant seventh of E flat major. E flat, but it was just E major a second ago, wasn't it? Well, E flat, E natural. How easily they can be confused in this faunish dream. And now where? What? Nowhere. A bar of silence. 6 slow, silent beats of no music, just as in Wagner's Prelude to Tristan. But do we know there's 6 beats? How do we count silence? Do we care? Not at all. We dream on. Again, that delicious wash of vagueness. And again, the dominant seventh, prolonged, prolonged. It's lovely, this dreaming along with Debussy, but it's no way to analyze music. We want to understand the vagueness, right? Not just bathe in it. And so we must wake up and look clearly at what we've just heard. What about that opening phrase of Pan's flute? Well, the first thing that strikes us is the highly chromatic nature of this phrase, as it languorously dips and rises between the 2 poles of G natural and C sharp. Now, those 2 melodic poles tell us something crucially important to the whole piece. They define the interval of the augmented fourth, an interval known as the tritone. That is, it's a span of 3 whole tone steps. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Now, this tritone interval has always had a peculiar significance throughout musical history, since it bluntly contradicts the basic concept of diatonic tonal meaning, that tonic dominant function that we found in the very first lecture to be at the heart of the harmonic series. You remember that? Those first overtones? And you hear the diatonic stability of those intervals? G to C, a perfect fourth, dominant tonic, the root factor of all tonality, as we observed it last week in the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony, and even in the Berlioz that we heard earlier, although used much more ambiguously, as you recall. But now in Debussy's Faun, that essential interval of the perfect fourth becomes an augmented fourth, which is a tritone, the most unstable interval there is, the absolute negation of tonality. And it is this interval, this so unsettled and unsettling interval, that the early church fathers declared it unacceptable and illegal, calling it diabolus in musica, the devil in music. It's precisely this interval of the tritone that Debussy adopts as his basic structural principle. And this is our leading clue to penetrating the vagueness and ambiguity of the piece as a whole, which carries out, mind you, to the very end, all the harmonic implications of that initial tritone. For example, do you remember when we were dreaming along with Debussy, how after these vague opening bars, there came the first suggestion of a key, E major, and how that briefly suggested tonality instantly slipped away in a wash of sound that left us floating in distant waters, this dominant seventh chord. But now we can see why this, of all chords, was Debussy's choice, because the root of that chord is B flat, and B flat is exactly a tritone away from E, which is where we thought we were. There's B flat, there's E, the tritone, the devil. And then in the ensuing bar of silence, we are left to float in blissful indecision between the two possibilities. B flat, E, silence. Do you begin to understand what I mean by Debussy's carrying out harmonic implications of the tritone? And equally important is the realization that this music is not just drowsily improvised, but carefully composed, intentionally designed to produce a specific ambiguous effect, which is a far cry from the conventional Hollywoodish idea of the moody composer improvising a vague dream in which anything can happen anywhere, Cornell Wilde or whoever it is. On the contrary, the Faun is a masterpiece of structure. In fact, the ending of this piece finally confirms that it was all conceived in the key of E major right from the beginning, that very key that was first so tentatively suggested. In other words, it not only ends in E major, but throughout its course, it is constantly referring to, or reverting to, or flirting with E major, or some diatonic relative thereof. And these clear tonal references occur every time there's a point of repose, a cadential close of an episode, or the arrival of a new one. And where the ambiguity arises is that between these points of tonal articulation, Debussy is just as consistently misleading us, just like Gerard Manley Hopkins, deliberately leading our ears astray, away from those diatonic landmarks by all kinds of phonological maneuvers and superchromatic freedoms, most of them, in fact, all of them, if you analyze it, evolving out of the basic tritone principle enunciated in the opening bars. Let me show you briefly what I mean. Here we are in our B flat seventh chord, right? Tritonically alienated from the E natural that had been teasing us into tonality. And then back we go to our opening tune, the exact same notes, only now harmonized. But harmonized how? In D major, foiled again. The promise of E major has been broken. But wait, what's this? We are in E major after all, but only for a flirtatious instant. Back we go to our B flat seventh chord, into it and right out again. More chromatic side slipping, leading us into not again. Yes, the same B flat seventh chord. And yet again. Why this insistence? Why does Debussy want to stamp that B flatness so firmly in our ears? Because the promise of E major is now about to come true. And he doesn't want us to see it coming. He wants to prepare us for it as ambiguously as possible, as far away from it as possible, therefore on the tritone, B flat. And when it finally does come, a happy arrival, the opening tune is heard for the third time, but now clearly and beyond all doubt in our long promised and hungrily wished for E major. At last. And this is what I meant by a point of repose, an arrival. And this new episode then proceeds quite lucidly in peaceful E major tonality up to its climax. Which then subsides into the first real definite cadence of the piece. And wonder of wonders, this cadential point of repose is in B major, the dominant of E major, just as it's supposed to be in the books, following the most classical tradition. Then where is ambiguity now? What's happened to vagueness, to the very point of this piece? But that is the point, that the larger overall ambiguity derives from this very interplay between the chromatic wanderings and these landmarks of tonal articulation. It's the same phenomenon we observed in Mozart, and again in Berlioz, and in Wagner. Chromaticism contained in diatonicism. Only here the chromaticism is enormously magnified, and if I may hop back to my earlier beat-up metaphor, there are still those tonal fences to contain it. They're a bit shaky, but they're standing. For instance, hardly have we had time to rest in our classical dominant cadence of B major when a new contradiction breaks out. And that's all based on that original tritone of G natural and C sharp, only now elaborated into a new formation called the whole tone scale. Do you sense that new special ambiguity? It's the sound of the whole tone scale, a unique invention of Debussy's, directly derived from that original tritone. It's not difficult to see how this new scale came to exist if you only recall that the interval of the tritone is actually a span embracing 3 whole tones. Let's say we start on C sharp, right? And then proceed by whole tone steps. 1, 2, 3, and we've landed on G natural, the other pole of the tritone, right? Now watch, if we simply repeat the procedure, starting from this G natural where we landed, and again go up 3 whole tones, 1, 2, 3, lo and behold, we're back to C sharp. Again, only an octave higher. In short, we've got a scale, that whole tone scale. See, what's actually happened is this: the octave span, C sharp to C sharp, instead of being divided diatonically, the usual way, or chromatically, which would be 12 equal half steps, is now divided into 6 equal whole steps. You see them? Starting C sharp, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, back to C sharp, you get 6 whole tones, get it? With that tritonic G natural at the exact midpoint of the octave between the 2 C sharps. Now, what's most important is that we've got a scale that cannot function tonally. that cannot produce a tonic or a dominant relation. And why is this? Because the scale, by its very nature, doesn't contain intervals of the fifth and the fourth, which, as you well know, are the first and strongest overtones of the harmonic series, and therefore the bread and butter of tonality. So no fifths and fourths, no tonic and dominant, no bread and butter. And by extension, there can obviously not be a circle of fifths either, and therefore no traditional modulations are possible. This whole tone scale is self-limiting, autistic, so to speak. In short, it is atonal, the first organized atonal material ever to appear in musical history. And because of its atonal nature, this new scale suddenly produced the most ambiguous sounds ever heard in music in this piece about a faun. Sorry. And just when we're beginning to feel utterly lost in these atonal woods, I did get lost in them, as a matter of fact, Debussy again reaches one of his points of repose, and we're home again, in E major at that, saved by the fence. But for a moment there, we were on the brink. Sheer phonology was becoming too important, too interested in itself, a goal of its own, and almost at the expense of semantic clarity. It's almost exactly what happens in the Mallarmé poem, where the images and symbols pile up in such alliterative profusion and with such seeming irrelevance and incongruity that reading it, we often feel awash in sound, ravishing sound to be sure, but we feel equally at sea as far as comprehension is concerned. And again, in literary terms, it's a case of phonology threatening to take over at the expense of meaning, and in fact, to produce meanings of its own. This is very subtle stuff and very hard to describe because it involves the mysteries of the creative process itself, and thus it's terribly hard to pinpoint it. But let me have one stab at it. In Mallarmé's poem, the faun has just been recalling a dream image. On the banks of a calm Sicilian pool, he has been cutting the hollow reeds to be subdued by talent, as he puts it, les creux roseaux domptés par le talent, an image, in other words, of the birth of music. And at that moment, et qu'au prélude lent, the moment he calls a slow prelude, he has a vision of a flight of swans, no, naiads, he says, running away or diving. You see, it's ambiguity all the way. You just never know which. Naiads, swans, are they running, are they diving? You never know. And just at this point come the following two lines, as the faun recalls the dream, sans marquer par quel art ensemble d'états là, trop d'hymen, souhaité de qui cherche le là. Literally translated, and therefore even fuzzier in meaning, it says, without noticing by what art there ran off together too much hymen desired by him who is seeking a natural. I won't even try to interpret that further. I would like only to point out that the word la, meaning the note A, stands at the end of a line where it rhymes identically with the last word of the preceding line, détala, meaning ran off. And I am asking if it's not therefore possible that the symbolic word la was born phonologically rather than syntactically, that it was motivated by its inherence in the earlier word détala, which, coming so soon after the musical idea of prelude, in turn suggested the musical association of la. I'll try to ask it more clearly. Might it not be that the la image was created not because the poet had intended to invoke it, because he had some meaningful idea in his mind and was looking for a structural way of saying it, but rather that the image was phonologically suggested in the preceding line. And I am proposing that this is only one of hundreds of such creative mechanisms in this poem, all examples of a phonological takeover at the expense of syntactic and semantic clarity. But notice, too, that the example I've been discussing involves rhyme, in fact, a rhymed couplet. And so it becomes instantly clear that Mallarmé, too, has his fences, his structural and tonal fences, so to speak. Just as the vaguenesses of Debussy are protected by those clear cadential resolutions, by classically stable, interrelated keys, so Mallarmé's dream within a dream is contained in equally classical structural forms, in perfect Alexandrine rhymed couplets. It's almost a shock to realize that this vaguest of poems, with its elusive but strongly evocative images, is written from beginning to end in strict hexameters. What's more, Mallarmé clearly indicates distinct episodes within the poem by putting them into italics and surrounding them with quotation marks, and these episodes, amazingly enough, are analogous to similar episodes in Debussy's musical counterpart. In other words, both the poem and the music preserve a clarity of structural articulation in spite of all vaguenesses. The poem and the music are both high on phonology pills, but in both cases the high, or the heightened consciousness, or whatever psychedelic term you care to use, is rationally contained. Both works have definite beginnings and ends, for instance, which provide frameworks that greatly aid perceptibility. And that's not so odd. I mean, most of these vague poems and pieces of music that were to follow the faun did not have clear beginnings and ends. Mallarmé begins with a forthright statement. For example, I wish to perpetuate these nymphs, though inevitably there's a little twist. Ces nymphes, je veux les perpétuer, an inversion of word order, where the normal sentence would read simply, je veux perpétuer ces nymphes. And in the same way, Debussy's opening is a clear flute melody, but with his little twist, that well-known tritone. And Mallarmé's ending is also clear enough in its intention. Il faut dormir, we must sleep. Couple adieu, a clear farewell, though again with its dreamy twist, je vais voir l'ombre que tu devins. I go to see the shadow that you became. And similarly, Debussy's ending is a clear farewell, yet sicklied o'er with the pale cast of the tritone. It's amazing, this ending, because it's so definite and yet indefinite at the same time. It is, as I told you, in E major, and the closing bars are as clearly terminal as an amen. In fact, they do say amen twice.